David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you here. There's a few things going by. Maybe lots of wonderful talks here at 3 to 4 every Monday, so come on back to hear more. And then a week from this Thursday, there's a big thing we've been doing for about 20 years down in Augusta at the Civic Center, the Maine Sustainability and Water Conference. A lot of the people in the Mitchell Center are the reason that keeps going and is such an important gathering for not just faculty and students, but folks from non-governmental organizations, state government, federal government, the private sector, and lots of sessions. Just check online. It's a wonderful, wonderful day. And if for some reason you look at it's not very expensive, but if that price is prohibitive, shoot me an email and we'll figure something out. It's Maine. So it's a pleasure to welcome Paul Anderson today. He told me I don't need to do an introduction, but that's the funnest part for me. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how it is that the Mitchell Center probably wouldn't be here without Paul. When I first arrived here over 10 years ago, one of the first people I went and talked to was Paul, because it was pretty obvious even from a distance. He was the director of Sea Grant at the time, in fact, in the middle of a 16-year-long stint as director. But that what he had really unique and valuable perspectives about were thinking about stakeholder needs. Stakeholders, just this kind of big name for all different people in the real world that are trying to solve problems that often have an environmental piece, but an economic piece and a community piece. And those were the kind of problems we wanted to work on here. So it was great to hear his thoughts about how to bring to all the different kinds of expertise that might be relevant to problem solving from a university, but also to connect it with the expertise that exists, the knowledge and know-how in the real world, right, to bring those together. Believe it or not, in the very first year we were here, we had a small grants competition where Paul was one of the reviewers, and so if you didn't get funded in that competition, it was a long time ago, but you should still complain to Paul about it. In any case, we funded some projects. 2 of them became key to a subsequent proposal we wrote that landed a $20 million grant from the National Science Foundation, so nice work, evaluator. So that helped us get this whole thing off the ground. Not too long after that, we actually had an idea for a project that involved looking at beaches and shellfish beds and pollution problems, and the first person I thought of to get advice from was Paul, because he had run the program within DMR that deals with many of those issues, the Department of Marine Resources. And once again, great advice, made sure he was part of that project, and we landed a $6 million grant. So I owe you dinner apparently for all of that, and I'm going to pay up tonight. But what's really amazing to me about Paul is the way he's brought all of this together into multiple leadership roles. So at Sea Grant for 16 years, he talked a lot about the nexus of science, community, and policy. So how do you connect science and decision-making with communities so that it works, so they have input, so they own the decisions. He helped launch the Marine Extension Team, which is this great hybrid between cooperative extension and Sea Grant that we've worked with many times here. We couldn't have done our work without a lot of those wonderful people, some of whom, by the way, I think are joining this meeting virtually. I think Esperanza Stanchev's up in the ceiling somewhere listening, as I understand it. I don't really get technology, but up there. Paul has a fascinating background, undergraduate and master's degrees in microbiology, which certainly played a key role in helping him run the DMR's shellfish program, the public health lab, monitoring red tides and bacterial pollution. He went on to play big leadership roles in CNET that I'm sure many of you know more about than I do. You may not know, however, that he's also an accomplished musician. Plays mandolin and guitar in Blue North. I think he started the bluegrass show on WERU, Browns Wound, Thursday nights, 8 to 10, on a couple Thursdays a month. So pretty wonderful mix of skills and a wonderful mentor, colleague, and friend for the work we do here. And today he's going to be talking about, of course, he's now no longer here. We lost him to the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. Big loss for the University of Maine, huge gain for that wonderful organization. And he'll be talking today about ecosystem-based fisheries management, catching the greased pig in eastern Maine. Thanks, Paul.
All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Dave, for allowing me to be here. And thanks to the Mitchell Center. Quite a privilege. So my talk, ecosystem-based fisheries management, catching the grease pig in eastern Maine. Any questions? um, okay, so you didn't know me until like 5 minutes ago. Now you know me, but for those of you who don't know me, I spent a lot of time here on campus. In fact, that building over there, Hitchner Hall, is where I got my degrees, undergrad and graduate in microbiology. That's my 36-year-old son during my graduation in 1983. After playing around here with fish disease stuff, and then a brief stint at Jackson Laboratory doing weird things to mice, I ended up going to DMR, where I had the privilege of designing and building that little laboratory right there. Anybody been to Lemoyne State Park might recognize that. And so we put that lab together, and therein I became an environmental microbiologist, which was a lot of fun. And working with DEP, we opened a whole lot of clam flats through the 80s and into the 90s. And so that's me back here with a bunch of DEP folks. Guess who that is? That's Robin Allen. She was my boss at the time. Kind of funny here that I now am following in her shadow at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. And that was then Governor King. So a little bit of my background there. I then came to the University of Maine, as Dave said, and spent about 16 years at Sea Grant, where I eventually became director. In 2014, I got asked to also direct the Aquaculture Research Center here on campus, and then we hit the CNET award, a $20 million 5-year project, which I think is going into year 5, so maybe we're in year 4. Anyway, and then last year, I threw my hat in the ring to take over for Robin Alden, who started the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries about 14 years ago as the Penobscot East Resource Center. And they changed the name to this and promoted or advertised the position. About a year ago, I thought, well, I've been a regulator for 10 years. I've been an academic for 15 years. Maybe I'll try it from the non-governmental organization side. So that's where I am. And now I work out of Stonington, beautiful place right there. And our office building is right on the harbor. I invite you to come down and visit sometime. And you can say hello to us and the staff and other things that go on down there. Our mission is quite simply to secure a sustainable future for fisheries and fishing communities in eastern Maine and beyond. And so today's talk is really going to talk about an initiative that we're a big part of to try to explore other ways for sustaining fisheries for the long haul. Our tagline is to fish forever, and that could be a verb, to actually fish forever, or we would just like there to be fish forever. So I want to just share a few highlights of what the center does before I get into the meat of the talk. We do a lot of work with the same blend that David talked about, similar to what the land grant does and the sea grant does, is bringing science and community together around policy and using communications and education in that mix. And so that nexus is where a lot of our programming happens. This is one of our staff, Mike Talhauser, working with a community member in the Penobscot River area, Bailey Bowden. They're working up some plankton samples there. I'll talk a bit about that initiative, which has everything to do with habitat restoration in that particular river system, which connects to fisheries, and we'll get on that in a moment. We've also done a lot of work with other state fisheries over the years. In fact, Dr. Carla Gunther is over here. Say hello. If you don't know Carla, she's been with the center for quite a while and did a lot of work with the scallop fishery and the scallop fishermen that helped to give them a voice in what the Department of Marine Resources ended up deploying for really what were some innovative approaches to managing that important fishery for Maine. I'll touch on the Sentinel Survey project a bit later in the talk too, because it nests nicely into this whole approach of exploring new ways to look at the science of fisheries. And this is a project we do in partnership with Young Chen here at the University of Maine, and along with NOAA Fisheries, DMR, the Nature Conservancy, to explore alternative ways of counting, measuring, and getting a sense of what the stock structure is for some of the groundfish in the Gulf of Maine. So again, I'll come back to that in a moment. We're also involved in managing a sector. Under the current fisheries regulations, fishermen are organized by sectors. They're not really geographic, but we manage one called the Northeast Coastal Community Sector. And we have several fishermen that are prosecuting that fishery in unique and different ways, primarily with hand gear, which is kind of cool. We also are involved in education because we believe that if we do fish forever, the guys who are doing it now aren't going to be doing it forever. That's just truth. And so we've got to look at young people. And so we've got this really cool program called the Eastern Maine Skippers Program that it works with high school students from Vinyl Haven to Jonesport Beals area right now. 8 schools, about 100 kids, 43 towns involved. And that's a picture of some of the kids last fall at the Marine Resource Committee, actually sitting in the legislators' seats at their table, getting a feel for what that feels like. And it's a pretty cool program. And then finally, if you come down to Stonington, you'll get to visit the Discovery Wharf. So bring your family and friends and come say hello, meet with us. And then there's a great touch tank and a touch wall, and some high technology going on there to help people understand what's going on with fisheries, not just in Stonington, but really in the state and in the region. And we expect to have a virtual reality display this year that we're borrowing from the Island Institute, in which you actually are in a lobster trap for one side of it, and the lobster comes creeping around you. So come on down and check us out. So the talk for today, and I'll try not to hit you with too many written words up here. I'm going to try to do this on the fly and keep it as interesting as I can. It can be a really complex topic and potentially very confusing. But this is the definition that NOAA uses and that we put into more or less the starting point for our work. Any number of you might have your own definition of this, and it's complex. The pieces that I'd like to highlight, I don't know if you can see the red. Do you see that? Anyway, geographically specified and including biophysical, physical, biological, economic, and social interactions. So there's different disciplines of factors that are at play in our ecosystem that really we need to understand if we're truly going to manage the prosecution of the fishery. So for me, this is a complex issue that begat my little analogy for my title. Anybody familiar with this sort of tradition in county fair parlance? Apologies to any PETA people. I assure you no pigs were hurt during the development of this presentation. Well, I'm betting on the little girl, actually, right there. I think she's off on it. So for me, the analogy is getting my intellectual hands around this concept for many years has been fun and intriguing, but as soon as you get a handle on a particular complex or a particular species or a particular component of the ecosystem, for me, it becomes elusive again, because there's another great idea. And how do you compartmentalize this in a way that you can really understand it and get your hands around it? So it's kind of a cheap analogy for me around the complexity of the issue. One more wordy slide. So EBFM supports a widely held view that traditional approaches to studying marine systems are often not well suited for dealing with that heterogeneity across these various ecosystem components, including rivers, coastal, ocean environments, especially in the face of rapid change. And so therein, I think, is why now the time is right for us to strike and to try to take this to another level and create something that is deep in knowledge, rich in connectivity, and adaptive to that change that's happening around us. Many of the structures and systems we put in place for counting fish, measuring environmental quality, and so forth are based on a certain level of certainty and consistency over time. And I think time and change around us has caused confusion in us being able to track those sorts of trends in the way we always have. So we've got to be a bit more nimble, I think, when it comes to gathering that information, understanding it, and being able to deploy it in a meaningful way as we manage our ecosystems. So there's been a lot on this for years, and many of you are experts more than I am, and a lot of it written in the academic journals, and I know there's places in the world that are playing around with how to deploy the concepts of ecosystem-based fisheries management. But we have a neat opportunity with our study here to take that a little bit deeper and maybe operationalize this in a way that perhaps hasn't been done completely in the United States. So that's what I'm excited to talk to you about today. The other day at the Fishermen's Forum, we did a session. Carla helped organize and facilitate a discussion. It was largely around collaborative fisheries research. How do you get fishermen involved in some types of science to inform fisheries management? And one of our colleagues, John Manderson from NOAA, brought this thing. And after promising we weren't going to confuse anybody with diagrams, he puts this up. And he called it the horrendogram, which is probably appropriate. So don't look at all the words, although you can if you want. Essentially, this is social ecology systems in play, right? This is social and cultural forcing kinds of issues, economic forcing kinds of issues, and then the ecologic pieces. Any one of you, students or faculty, whoever you are, might be studying a particular issue, particular piece here, and that's all really, really important. Some of the challenge we face is how to look outside of the boxes in which we're most comfortable. And what are these connecting lines? I think the lines in the end become the more meaningful place to understand what those interactions and what those bits of knowledge really mean. And so don't study that too much. But in the end, this is the complexity of what we're working on. And if you drilled into any one of these and then got sidelined to the other one, therein is the greasy pig. So in the fall of last year, we had an opportunity that's been emerging for several years. In fact, Josh Stoll defended his thesis right at this podium, a year and a half or two ago. And Richard Merrick from NOAA was up here for that. Richard's now retired, and his place is a guy named John Hare. And John, it turns out, is equally enthusiastic about this idea of advancing ecosystem-based management in a meaningful, let's do it sort of way. He's an ecosystem guy. And Richard Merrick preceded him and was equally enthused. And with some coaching and pushing from Robin Alden, and I think Carla was probably in that push as well, we managed to bring them to the table and worked around developing this agreement called a CRADA. Now, I keep saying this to people that we need a different name for this initiative. It's not a CRADA. It's more. CRADA is just the instrument that brought us together. It's a cooperative research and development agreement. Federal government uses it to set up relationships with non-governmental entities for which there can be a more free movement of information and maybe resources. We weren't promised any resources with this. But we did sign this thing, and it's NOAA Fisheries, largely the Fisheries Science Center out of Woods Hole, the DMR, and at the highest level, and us. So this little tripartite group is going to try to get our hands around this issue and advance it and find ways for you all to come play and see if you can get your hands around the greasy pig. So we signed this thing. That's John and Robin, Meredith Mendelson, Deputy Commissioner for DMR, signing the agreement. It was all happy. Yay. It was a great thing. And so what is it? Well, the geographic piece of this, we mentioned that earlier, is eastern Maine, Hancock and Washington counties. And we've kind of couched it down to including Penobscot Bay, probably for some logical reasons. Geophysically, it's defined by the eastern Maine coastal current, which oceanographers here from this campus and others in the region have proven and studied for many, many years. So the eastern Maine coastal current does happen. Water comes down here from Fundy, kicks off at Penobscot Bay. Very little of it ends up over here. So this could represent a bioregion. And in fact, we're going to use it that way. NOAA, a few years ago, with some work that Mike Fogarty and others had done, had actually defined that in a paper and said, yes, this is a separate component of the Gulf of Maine ecosystem. And so that's kind of its scope. And then we've sort of talked about, well, how do we include some of the ocean and some of the land and everything in between? And loosely, I won't even tell you who came up with this, but it's 40 up and 40 out. Roughly up above the watersheds, up where some of the meaningful, interesting stuff is happening with habitat restoration. And out here, I don't even know what fathom line that is, but it's enough of the space where we're going to get a lot of information that probably interrelates, but isn't quite thought of that way yet. So part of getting this going, and if you read any of the EBFM stories and how this is being explored around the world, you got to know what you know and then decide what you don't know and figure out how to fill in the gaps. And so we will be doing that. We're going to try to get our hands around what's going on in the region for monitoring of the ecosystem, monitoring of various critters and species through surveys and otherwise. What is the observing world telling us? Certainly we have a long legacy of buoy-based observing in the waters here that we can tap into. There's a lot of research. Many of you in the room or otherwise have or are doing research in the area related to either the biophysical elements or some of the sociologic elements that we're talking about. We've been tapping into and exploring some methodologies for really formalizing the capture of local ecological knowledge and at the same time deformalizing that. What's the word for deformalizing? Informalizing it, whatever, to take it in the other direction into cafes and wheelhouses and docks to really get the knowledge, to really get the conversations going with the industry and the people in the communities in Eastern Maine, and try to bring all of that into this growing knowledge. And then, and I think already there's opportunities for synthesis, and many of you are doing some of that, but I use that word really to think about the value add of considering one another's data, one another's methods across disciplines, and see if that yields either better answers or more likely better questions. And so we want to take a step here in our process of this creative agreement and kind of assemble. It might be a rubric, it might not be. I can imagine it being a very complicated rubric, but we'll begin to assemble who's doing what and where, and what do the data streams look like that we know we have. And then from that, can we start to explore what do we need to know? What are the gaps and what's out there? And as we have those questions that are asked about from fishermen of things they're observing on the water, how do we incorporate those into our hypotheses and into our research and figure out what those gaps are for other information? Again, that local engagement is really important. That's been a principle of mine, as David said, through my entire career. And the Sea Grant Place was a great way to learn that and practice it. Living and working in Stonington is an unbelievable opportunity to practice that. And we'll be taking this on the road and visiting the other really important fishing communities along the coast of Eastern Maine to do that. Hopefully we can inspire new research and new questions and new ideas. Do more of that synthesis towards better questions. And all the time throughout this, we have to be paying attention to the policy frameworks that exist and do the creative thinking around what could be different, what policies could be different that are more nimble, that might be more localized, more capable of achieving what we all want around sustaining fishing and having fish forever. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples. Many of you know more about these issues than I do. I'm not a fish person. I'm a microbiologist, which means I'm a very tiny scientist. But I can play fish guy on TV. So in the lobster fishery, our most iconic, one of the world's, probably the world's most valuable fishery, we know its life cycle. We know what it does. But it's not behaving the way we thought it did. If you're tracking assessments and management efforts and what's going on with settlement and stuff, there's something we don't get yet, even though we've studied the hell out of it for a long time. But we do know there's things going on in our ocean chemistry, right? Whether that's pH and ocean acidification or probably nutrients, and how nutrients are actually different under different temperature and pH regimes, and that the microbiome, that is the stuff that I do know about. The microbes are probably different, and there's a flux probably playing around in the water column that is in some way related to how these critters survive. The habitat is changing, whether intentionally by harvesting of different things, or as different trophic levels come and go, perhaps some of the old relationships between flora and fauna are changing. So understanding that, and then it turns out the temperature is a critical part of the habitat. We think of habitat as a physical structure. Well, not all the time. And so temperature, turns out, looks like the lobster fishery is shifting outward these days. There's more landings happening in deep water nowadays. What's that about? Is it a temperature thing? Is it what's triggering that? There's lots of questions that can be asked. And then how does all that relate to both food for the lobster and then And then you take that and say, okay, well, we can study that. That's really cool. And then we got this really important fishery, and we can link this to jobs and things, and I'll make that link in a moment. But then we got the whale in the living room. It is really going to be a problem for understanding the future of Maine's lobster fishery. And so there's a question. If the lobster are truly being caught more offshore, and we have more vertical lines and more traps and more fishing activity out there where right whales are more likely to be, then the conflict that is going to hit the fan pretty soon in that regard is not going to get easier. So that's just a complex example of some of what we're talking about. The diatomous species connectivity that I mentioned earlier, of course we have the obvious river, estuary, ocean linkages, and we have these fish coming and going, nice little canaries telling us what's going on. And the way we're moving nutrients and carbon in and out of the water systems and out into the oceans, and what's the ramifications of that for the population of fish in the ocean. I have a short video I'm going to show while I'm talking. So there's been some great stuff going on, of course, with habitat restoration in the upland. This is the Penobscot River, one of the largest habitat restoration projects on the planet. It was going, and a lot of waterway has opened up. Hundreds of miles, thousands of acres of habitat has come about. This is a video of some of our work going on in the Bagaduce River system, trying to understand if we open up and create better connectivity between the river herring fishery, alewives, in these river systems, what is that doing? And is that, how does stocking efforts relate to pulling out beaver dams or moving out blockages from road culverts and so forth like that? So there's several small ponds in the Bagaduce system. We're working with local communities to answer their questions, get them involved in the science, whether that be in plankton tows or counting fish. And then the hope is that the communities can sustain that data stream, share their interests, and there might be some changes that have to happen in policy. Right now, as I understand it, the ASMFC, as it manages the alewife fishery, requires a community to have 10 years of data on their coming and going of alewives, and that's a long time. And I just mentioned change happens. Well, change is going to happen in that 10 years. So what are you really measuring? So we're talking with the DMR and other partners in that system to see if there's a way for us to expedite and improve that counting effort and improve how that ends up in the policy. So that's one example of some of the work that we're doing. And then the connectivity. So what does it matter? These river herring and these other diatomous species that come and go. There's all kinds of questions. A lot of you, Gail Zadlewski and company, and many other people are asking that question about the trophic cascade and what do the returning diatomous species really mean? And one of the questions might be this character here in the codfish, and there's a ton of questions you can ask here. What do they feed on, right? Well, if it's those forage fish, that's neat. And if they're planktivorous, well, what about shifts in the plankton? And what happens with the physical parameters around driving this plankton change? And then if they're diatomous species and they're coming and going up the rivers, then what's the health of those rivers mean? And the land use up there and the dam removals that we just talked about. And then, what eats cod and what's down on the other side of the spectrum in terms of capturing and understanding stock structure of the codfish that we want to catch and eat. But we got to count them. And so therein comes some of our other programs, is trying to understand what is going on with the ground fishery. Is there really a potential for some of it to return to eastern Maine if it's just a question of food? Some people are saying no, it's not a question of food. Well, then what is the question? And so traditional, this is where, pause for a second, a little humor. The only thing I would add at the bottom here, number 6, is repeat. Another quick video while I talk to you about our Sentinel survey. So one of the traditional, this is another project that we're working on, and you'll watch these guys do some sampling and catching the fish. The traditional way to allocate the groundfish resource is to count the fish and then divvy them up, through quotas. Well, it's hard to count fish. turns out, because they're under the water. And so traditional method is to use trawl surveys, and they're the federal and state trawl surveys. And they've been proven over the years, if done correctly and the information managed correctly and modeled, you can get a better sense of what the assessment is for each of the species. And the groundfish are paid attention to very closely, as you probably know. Unfortunately, most of the fishing for those species is not in eastern Maine, it's in western Maine, and most of that product is being landed either in Portland or more likely in Massachusetts. And some of the challenges of doing a trawl survey, anybody here been on the water on the coast of Maine, near shore water, boating, sailing, fishing, whatever? There's a lot of navigational hazards out there. They're called buoys, and they're affixed to a lobster trap, and they keep you from trawling just any old place. So there are limits to just the practical deployment of a trawl survey in terms of that as really an important piece of the data that goes into tracking these assessments. So what these guys are doing is more surgical, I think, and this was developed in partnership with NOAA Fisheries folks in Yongchen to go to specific stations that are statistically established and repeatedly visited, along with complemented with some stations that the fishermen get to choose. And they're using hook and line, and they're either using a rod and reel, or they're using a baited long line. And there's a baited long line there they're pulling up. And what they catch, that's our student Maddie Rodrigue. Maddie's now down in Washington doing really important things as a Knaus fellow. But here she was a dual degree student working in Yongchen's lab, and it turns out the fisherman's name is Maddie too. Maddie Thompson out of Monhegan. I think he fishes out of Rockland or somewhere. And so they're collecting fish, and as they do that, they're taking samples. You can see she's taking various clips for DNA analysis, some isotope analysis, some stomach contents, and various other parameters that will go into the database. And this has been going on for 6 years. The feds in the state are very interested in it continuing, and so it will. And we think it's a good example of yet another innovation that we can help to do with fishermen, getting them involved. It's not just a ship of opportunity. They're actually involved in helping us to shape the design of the project. There's probably other examples we can do in that regard. So in the intertide, there's plenty of this similar complexity of connectivity. You know, our third most valuable fishery right now is the soft shell clam. This guy's clamming. All kinds of issues related to the productivity of our soft shell clam fishery. Could be pollution, could be areas that have to be closed for pollution and public health problems. Could be that there's other issues playing out. Maybe the wormer guys are the problem. If you get wormer guys and clam guys in the same room, you want to hope they left their hose in the truck, because they don't see things eye to eye. These guys think that the guys that are rototilling the mud, taking worms, are flipping it and flipping baby clams or other clams out and making them vulnerable to other predators, birds and such, and or crushing the clams. So this is a tough negotiation going on in the intertide. In some places, the habitats are different enough that the conflict is kind of passive, but it's also, but it's an issue, and it bumps into sociological issues and governance too, because towns actually have the authority to manage this population, but not this one. It's interesting. Oh, and then you throw this guy in the mix, the European green crab, or other predators, and we also have other sorts of questions that can be added to the mix, and observations that need to be added to the mix. In all likelihood, the persistence of this predator over the last 10 years is probably related to climate change. We haven't had winters hard enough to kill them off. And they're a bit ephemeral, but when they're not ephemeral, they're pretty obvious. And they're nasty. So in the intertide, there's a whole complexity of issues too. And I guess the final piece that I'll share in this regard is aquaculture. And how does that fit into our coastal ecosystems? Is that a positive thing? The ecosystem, can it be done in a way that is okay with the ecosystem? And what are the sociological opportunities related to this for communities that need jobs in eastern Maine? So these are salmon pens. They're fed aquaculture, so there's a certain concern around their husbandry and what that means for the ecosystem. But as you know, there's other kinds of aquaculture that are coming online too that may be a little more benign in terms of their environmental footprint, but are still having to fit into this rapidly crowding coastline. So whether it's the oysters or seaweed, there's other questions that can be asked about their husbandry. And the CNET project that David mentioned earlier is certainly trying to explore some of the sustainability elements of those two parts of the aquaculture picture. So back to the CRADA and where we're going next. We signed it back in September. Those are the three guys that signed it on. It's a 5-year scope initially. We hope that it becomes a way of doing business that doesn't need a CRADA, doesn't need agreement, it needs wisdom. And that 5-year scope will develop a research framework. That's the first out of the blocks, is to figure out what are the right questions to ask, who are the right players to recruit, and how can we find some low-hanging fruit and bring in some funding and get some of these new ideas rolling along in this place. We're involved in the organizational development of this, and frankly, outside of Carla's soft launch at the Fishermen's Forum 2 weeks ago, today is the first time anybody's really talked about this. We haven't done anything in terms of formal communication for no particular reason. We are going to do a fall workshop to continue our organization around some of this information as we put it into this rubric that we've been talking about. And we're planning on hosting a State of the Science conference next year, 2019. Carla's leading the organization of that. We've got members of each of the partner institutions that are helping out with organizing that. We'll do everything we can do here. We want to do in Eastern Maine. Eastern Maine needs attention. They need help. And we want to try to put that conscience and their sense of place into all of our work. Engagement, planning, and evaluation. It's my hope to get some funding under our belt that can help us do the planning well and evaluate this from the beginning. Develop an evaluation process that's using a developmental evaluation kind of approach, recognizing change in every plan, and being sure that we're measuring our outcomes and impacts accordingly so that we can continue to build the buzz. Our role at MCCF really is the community engagement stuff that I've talked about, and having this conversation on the docks and in the cafes and in the wheelhouses. Do that organizational development work, facilitate partnerships. I think that's something I'm good at, and we have a strong ethic at the center, as many of you do in Maine, is that you partner because you have to here. And I think in Maine we have a strong capability of doing that, and I think that resonates well with the work of the Sustainability Center too over the years. We'll be doing the communications, and it's my principal job to try to explore funding opportunities. I, of course, would like to sell this to the highest bidder and see if we can do more than put out the bake sale and the tip jar, but actually go high and talk about this as a pilot program where we might get some real traction with some people that want to do invest in some transformative research in a place-based way. Our partners at NOAA think of this as a pilot program. They don't have one like this anywhere else. And it's kind of big enough, small enough, it's in the corner, it's not going to raise too much of a ruckus, but we can explore some things. And so I think they're enthused to be a part of this, even though a lot of it tends to be in state waters. They're ecosystem folks. They're interested in those connections. Data management is going to be a bear. And we'll be leading the conversation around what that looks like coming from CNET and here at the university. I know you have the Advanced Computing Group and some capacity there. And we'll be exploring what are other models around the world for grabbing, capturing, managing these complex data sets so that practitioners like you and scientists can access what they want to when they need to. And I know that's a huge thing to say in one sentence, but it is what it is. And then, as I mentioned before, we want to identify the policy needs that might emerge. Regarding partnerships, we have ready-made partners in this array here. It's called the Down East Fisheries Partnership. And you probably know most of these individuals. They all have a keen interest in the sustainability of Eastern Maine in different ways. And some of that's through understanding economic and demographic trends. Some of that's through biological types of research and science. And some of that's through engaging landowners and conservation types of initiatives. And so it really creates an interesting place for us to to host a similar conversation and get their enthusiasm and their stakeholders. So we kind of increase our footprint of penetration into other parts of the communities, upland and coastal, through this kind of partnership, along with anyone else who wants to come along. A few things on the people. So those folks can connect us to a lot of the people, but there's some interesting trends down here in Washington and Hancock County. Washington County is one of the poorest counties in the United States, second only to parts of West Virginia, I think. And they've had a seafood economy in the past. It's been very important. We believe it's going to be, this remains, and it's going to be important. At least that's part of our gambit. This is the Stinson factory in Prospect Harbor. This guy right there, they used to do herring. They don't anymore. They cut lobster, which isn't a bad thing. They're employing people, but it's, you know, they're tapping into the monoculture of lobster. There's all kinds of these facilities that have mothballed in eastern Maine over the years because there's nothing to cut, and so the workforce has kind of gone away, which creates some of these demographic challenges. I'm going to hit you with a few graphs here. Warning, this is one you've seen in different ways, but it's really the complex of the top, in this case, 5 fisheries and the relative landings across 10 years or so. Not surprisingly, lobster's dominant. Lobsters continue to creep. This is 2015. You know, we had a slight diminution in the last year, so maybe the current year is down here somewhere. Anyway, the point being that the complex is not diverse enough. It's way too much of a monoculture. And if we're going to have a seafood economy, we probably have to work on trying to beef up some of the other species while we do that. This is other demographics. This is Hancock and Washington County population. Hancock County in blue, Washington County in green. Interesting to note that the population is essentially the same from 110 years ago. That's kind of bizarre. I bet that's not that way in Portland. But also note that the population continues to decrease in Washington County. And you couple that to unemployment rates, and although these counties, these towns are towns. Statewide, Machias is blue, Ellsworth is green, statewide is light blue, and red is Calais. For those who don't know, Calais and Machias are in Washington County. And so it's tracking with the national numbers, and coming down these days, but it lags behind. Eastern Maine has always lagged behind in this kind of thing. So unemployment's there. There's a need for workers, and there's an opportunity for workers. Yet the wage down there is way behind everywhere else as well. So that creates a social problem for us in understanding whether all this biophysical work that we might do to restore fisheries and everything, if we can get that working and get some diversity and access to different fisheries, we still have a sociological challenge there of understanding whether it can truly host and stand up a viable seafood economy, including questions of workforce. You know, who's there to work? What's the training needs for keeping them there? The civil society is struggling in some of these towns, just keeping their sewers infrastructure viable, keeping their fire departments. Lubec closed its high school 2 years ago. So education is a challenge. You all know there are other social challenges related to the whole country right now with addiction, and it plays out in this part of the state too. And then gentrification is kind of an interesting play because that actually brings some people in, but they're not going to cut fish. I can tell you that. And then the aging of our population is also another conundrum. So I think there's room for a better understanding of what this whole dynamic plays out in the social science work through anthropology and sociologists that can try to understand people's motivations and what keeps them interested. So we've talked about scale. Scale matters. We think that local and nimble in time and temporally is critical. I think that thinking across disciplines, understanding how we can better ask questions and then better answer them, and probably train better scientists and better practitioners as we play around with different people's words, different people's methods, different people's ways of looking at information. Engaging this, and this is something I fully believe in, is we cannot do this to the communities. We cannot do this to fishermen. We have to do it with them. If they have them with us, they have to help us understand what the real questions are. And then ultimately come out of this with better knowledge, deeper knowledge. It's more nimble knowledge that pays attention, and that the management that comes out of it can try to be as adaptive as possible given the complexities of government. And governance is a different word. Jim Wilson and I have talked about the distinction between those two words many times, and you all can study the governance thing, and we'll figure this out together so that we can have fish forever. I found this weekend. It's a quote from Commissioner Kelleher. He's the commissioner of DMR, and I'm highlighting here. This year's decline in lobster landings is by no means a signal that the sky is falling, but it does highlight the need to make sure our management measures adapt to change. This is true for all fisheries. It's the best way to ensure resilience of our marine resources and opportunity for future generations. I couldn't have said that better. That was probably from the forum, I don't know. But I'll close with that. If you want to join us, that's my contact information. Write that down. Stay in touch. We'll let you try to catch the greasy pig with us if you're interested. And that's all, folks. We do have time for questions. Yes, sir.
My assumption about why we have so many lobsters is that we have so few fish to eat them. Is that true?
I think that's one of the factors, and there are lobster fishermen who don't want us to recover the cod fishery because they are indeed predators to juvenile lobsters. So yeah, there are predators missing in that relationship, in that ecosystem. But the lobster fishery is an anomaly right now. The landings, although high and important and coming down is scary, they're way higher than they should be, or would have been, 20 years ago, Jim? 20, 30 years ago? Yeah, and so, I mean, if you got back to that stasis and we got the rest of the ecosystem kind of back into some sort of a balance, yeah, there's going to be less lobster probably because of either the trophic cascade and the predator-prey relationships. But none of that happens overnight. It'll be slow and gradual. Some of the work that we'll do with if we catch cod is their stomach analysis can tell us how much they're relying on invertebrates for their food, and begin to understand what is that, who's eating who. Questions? Yes.
Could you comment on the fin fishery and forage fish in the Gulf of Maine?
You mean beyond the ground fishery? So finfish in the Gulf of Maine, we think about the ground fish as being the cod and the haddock and pollock and flounders, things on the ground, and then there's pelagic fisheries. So the finfish, different species are showing some recovery in parts of Maine, and others not so much. And in eastern Maine, there's less recovery, apparently, as far as assessments show. In some ways, that's why the Sentinel survey may show us what's going on there now, and as it changes, might come back. There are those who are in the commercial fisheries world under the current management structures who say the finfish fisheries are doing fine, and they're landing fish in Portland and Gloucester and so forth. But regulators and other people have different opinions about that. But then there's a lot of uncertainty around how we count those fish, and so I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
And the forage fish?
Which are like the alewives I showed you?
Well, and also the herring. I'm thinking of how the puffins weren't able to feed their babies herring. They fed them butterfish, which the babies couldn't swallow, and they died. And what about that? Do we have herring babies out there?
Yeah, we have a herring fishery out there. I don't know that story well enough. I don't know if Carla knows much about that.
Well,
Beyond the river herring.
It's mostly it's a temperature change. So if we had a colder regime last year, so I think if we were to see what happens, what comes up this coming season, reduced, but it's also with the warmer climate regime, butterfish were coming in from the south, and it was just becoming a more, comparatively more abundant fish and easier for the puffins and the birds.
I'm always interested in the sort of balance sheet between the positive aspect of a successful fishery and the related negative aspect of social distress and community, in some cases, disintegration. Where are the social scientists in your group?
There, there's this group. There's one right there.
Are
Aaron
they
Strong.
Are they institutionally grouped in your
There's one
fisheries?
right over there.
I didn't see the logo. I didn't see the social science logo. Which is sort of opportunistic engagement is one thing, but conceptual inclusion of the perspective is another.
Yeah.
And that method, it seems to me, in most fisheries management is despite lip service to the contrary, is missing.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Peter. And we want to try to highlight. I tried to use the word social as many times as I could in that 45 minutes. Did I do it right, Christine? All right. 10 years ago, I thought social science was everything that wasn't biophysical, and then I learned, and turns out it's a lot of different things, right, Aaron? The Economic Council is part of our group, so the head of the Sunrise County Economic Council is an economist who pays attention to some of those kinds of themes through the demographic data that's available through his structures. That's not enough.
I'm talking about public health, for example.
Public health. Yeah.
That's one thing that Charles was talking about the other day is public health, and another, we have one of the chief social scientists, the anthropologist Patricia Clay from NOAA Fisheries. She's in our creator group too. She's one of the, not a signatory, but one of the key people participating. But in convening this first science conference and workshop, we have several active social scientists kind of coming in on the steering committee, and we'll be involving them from the ground up in trying to create a map of what we know, as Paul was describing before.
Back there first, Jim, and then here. Yep.
Social scientists, probably here in Maine and other places around the state, probably have a stronger group of social scientists engaged in this than anywhere else I can think of. If anything, you name in other places, ecology of the planet, GIS, GRI, University of Maine, they're just full of too many social scientists concerned with these things and doing really good work on it.
And if I can just put a number on Jim's thing, so of the things that Paul and Jim helped us launch here that led to the Mitchell Center, over 175 faculty have worked in interdisciplinary teams on this and other sustainability challenges. Over half of those have been social scientists of every possible field, working quite closely. And I agree with Jim. It's become a model. I just got an email this morning from somebody from Stanford wanting to know how we figured out how to do this. And I think, Paul, you said something wonderful. I'd never heard it said that way before. Something about like it's Maine, so you have to figure out how to work together. I couldn't agree more.
It's just unfortunate that NOAA's definition of ecosystem-based management has a comma, including humans, at the very end of the definition. I know, we can't work with that, but yeah, at least it's there. Pretty sure it was written in red for the very second to last draft.
Yeah, by the way, our agreement with them did wander into some more detailed elements that could have foretold some future scenarios and some provocative places to go in the policy world, but that got truncated, possibly by lawyers, quite probably. And so we ended up with an agreement to do a research framework and see where we go. But it's a good step. Yes, sir.
First, thank you for your presentation. Kind of on that note, you started your presentation with this two fish forever, whether it meaning fishing in the verb or that they're both fish.
Yeah.
Do you find that sort of tension between sort of the, I guess, more economic, sociological, where it would be, yes, two fish to give people jobs to produce sort of economic, versus the physical or biological, or ecosystems? Like how much do you see other instances of that tension or of those coming into conflict, and how do you sort of respond or try to work through those tensions?
Thanks. That's an interesting question. So I think that there's fish forever is a tip of the hat to the ecosystem services at play. And fish, perhaps as a canary in the coal mine, are if we have fish or we have organisms surviving and propagating and proliferating, maybe that's telling us something about our ecosystem and the things that we can affect. And so I think I didn't make that up. I don't know. I inherited the Fish Forever moniker, but it's a clever play on, well, we want the place to be good. Take care of the place, and then if you do that well, we also have a stream of commerce that's available to us in terms of commercial fishing, and in some places recreational fishing, not so much Maine's coast. But so I'm not answering your question either. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
Any thoughts on, my preconception about scallop dragging, it must be really bad for the bottom. Is that the case? Any thoughts on that?
I think I'm going to ask Carla to answer that because I had the same impression, but it turns out the habitat that scallops tend to be in, which can be dragged safely, it's not all gnarly and going to sink your boat because your drag got hung up, is more sandy and soft and probably somewhat resilient to that activity. But you want to try that?
It's a fun dance for the state of Maine. So there's a couple trade-offs. One, here in Maine, there's pretty much never been a study about the effect of dragging on the bottom in the various habitats. So for what Paul had just said, where a fisherman's not going to want to drag over really complex bottom because it's just not good for the gear and it's not good for his safety, especially in the middle of winter. So they tend to leave that area alone, and that's where the divers go. So what we really end up having is a diver dragger. They are not usually compatible as far as ecologically, conservation-wise. But the amount of scallop resource that we have on the bottom, there are ways you can configure that drag. There are ways you can distribute the effort so that you're not constantly plowing over the same bottom with a really heavy head bale, digging into and completely leveling the sandy or the mud bottom. There's a way that you can probably fish an area that has less, or what they call the intermediate disturbance hypothesis in ecology, where you're disturbing it just enough that some new things can come in there and resettle the bottom. But we also have this balance with diving and not dragging for lobster, or dive-only scallop fishery probably wouldn't give us enough economic benefit to the state. So we have this beautiful resource out there that's very lucrative. If we were dive-only, there's no way we can harvest enough to make the maximum economic benefit from the resource. So it's that real sort of catch-22 about how can we make sure we understand our drags, how do we enforce the drag composition and configuration. Right now we're essentially spatially managing the drag fishery. So what we should be doing is allowing people to space out so that they aren't just getting, you don't have 40 boats just dragging over the same place throughout the whole season. That's part of the balance right now that we're trying to strike in the fishery in that current. But, there's all kinds of stuff. There's lots of room for experiment around dragging.
Thanks, Carla. Thank you all for coming today. Appreciate it.